Hi everybody, my name is Oleksandra Dudka. I am software architect in Sigma Software with more than 15 years of experience in information technologies. Today this talk is about architecture inconsistency. It is not a secret that every architect notices that the already built system has a gap between the code or infrastructure and the initial model. It means architecture. So let us discuss the architecture inconsistency topic, how to manage inconsistency between architectural decisions and the implemented systems. First of all, I would like to highlight that we are not talking about inconsistency in architecture documentation, inconsistency of architecture views. It's another thing. So let's focus on architecture inconsistency as a gap between the code, infrastructure, and initial architecture in form of documentation or diagrams and so on and so forth. In the beginning, I would like to add some context. Who struggles a lot with architecture inconsistency? The sure thing is those people are architects. Especially it's become critical if you are an architect in consulting. I know this because I have been working in consulting for many years. Architect in consulting usually helps multiple companies to get the best architecture for its numerous products. It's really challenging because they have many ongoing projects where they are not architect full time. Each project could have different technologies, different teams, and sure thing, many deadlines that are not related to each other. They must switch between all these various products on the different stages of the development and at the same time guarantee that the architecture of the product from the beginning, from the proposal or discovery stage, achieves not only functional requirements, but also qualities of the system. And all this on time. You can imagine it's hard. For such architects, it's hard to measure their success as an architect, how good they do their job. Usually, you start such a discussion and you can have many different options. Sometimes architects say that if a project is successfully rolled out on time on production, it's a success. Yes, that is true. But as for me, it's not an architect metric. Sometimes it could be a variety of technologies used, many how many cutting edge technologies applied to the project. It could be qualities as well. Does our system match initial qualities requirements? Furthermore, after such a lengthy discussion, we end up with the phrase, okay, customer is happy, so that means everything is great. I'm against such measurements, but about the architecture's work. The sure way to see if the architect succeeded is to measure the architecture inconsistency on the release day of the product. I'm anticipating the question, why inconsistency? Why not technical or architecture depth? According to definition, depth is about making decisions that do not match best coding practices or architecture to provide new features urgently. At the same time, inconsistency is a difference between planned architecture, described architecture, agreed architecture with customer, and the current state of product, current parameters of the product. Why could be the reasons for architecture inconsistency? Most of reasons are tightly coupled with software architecture document. Method names, class names, then become outdated at the first day of the development. Design ends just before development starts. As if you leave the team at the very beginning of or even before the development, as an architect, don't be surprised to see something else in the first release day on production. The next reason is the development starts before non-functional requirements are identified or fully identified. Without such entities or qualities and its specific values, it's almost impossible to choose appropriate architecture and reason about it. Development starts before architecture creation. Here, no comment. No architecture, no inconsistency, no problem. Important thing is that team do not understand the model. It's quite usual problem and reason why we get inconsistency. If you select UML as an architecture description language and team don't know it, your documentation makes no sense. First rule, identify stakeholders, and your team members are stakeholders of documentation. You need to find the right way to communicate with them, find the right architecture description language. It could be boxes and lines. It's okay if it works for your team. Find the best language to communicate. It's a key to success. Team do not trust the model. If you dictate as an architect your decisions, team won't trust you. In the document, you should reason about your solution, provide evidence and arguments as more as you can to give them understanding about reasons of your decisions. The next is the design without explaining how to build the system. I'm sure that an architect responsibility not only to draw blocks and lines and reason about different architecture patterns or styles, he also can recommend the way how to set up a development and management process on the project. And the last one, too many words. Nobody wants to read documentation 100 pages long. It's hilarious. All these reasons are tightly coupled with quality of documentation. And also, reasons are about right, transparent communication between the team and the architect during the product development. Consistency. Does consistency exist? I bet it's a myth. In the very beginning, the consistency of the architecture and the code infrastructure tends to zero. After several iterations, it starts increasing because of new features development. At the end, it could tend to 100. To be clear, when I talk about inconsistency, I don't talk about only one number, one parameter for architect to observe. It's about different areas of your product development that you, as an architect, have to monitor, control, and manage with your team. I ended up with 6 key areas to monitor to increase the chance of zero inconsistency of software product development. Here you can see code, infrastructure, qualities, project scope, process, documentation, and technical depth. So the code metrics could be the next one. Pull request amount, unit test coverage, modularity, code duplication, code smells, any other metrics that you can imagine, you can apply it here. But take care about only top 5 code metrics. Otherwise, the amount of measurements could be enormous. The next one is infrastructure. Important thing here to monitor infrastructure cost altogether and split it by different environments. Failed build count could be quite useful, SLI, SLO, and so on. I don't recommend to track all the infrastructure metrics. For that, you have the separate dashboards that should be in place on every project. But here should be some only 5 important metrics important for your specific project. Qualities. It's something that you need defined before starting the development. It's really important to discuss with the customer, with the product owner of the product. And here could be performance, scalability, availability, and other elements so that you can specify for your project. But here you need to use not only high availability, you need to put here numbers, exact numbers that your product should achieve at the day of release. Scope and process. It's not about project management, but software architect, especially when he is not allocated for full time on the project, has to get know somehow about how everything is going. And to track this, maybe you can use feature amount and velocity of your team. Software documentation. You also have to discuss this with your team, with customer as well. What software documentation could be enough to have on the project? And you need to track from the very beginning the actual state of all this document. It could be a software architecture document, README files in all the repositories you have, API documentation, and so on and so forth. Technical or architecture depth. I believe that it's not the responsibility of an architect to track this, but software architect should control and monitor these parameters. Let's move on to the inconsistency management. So stop for a minute and imagine how it could be looks like in your imagination. Probably in the ideal world, there maybe should be such tool presented on the screen. In ideal world, architect should have a single dashboard where all his ongoing products are presented. And at any time, he can be notified about accurate inconsistency and do something. Yes, there are tools to get information about modularity, cohesion in the source code. These tools are great if we're talking about software architecture assessment. And you can definitely use these tools from time to time, and especially before the product release. But there is no tool that could handle altogether documentation, code, infrastructure, and do this on the regular way, in some regular way with a high level of transparency. It's still an open question. In the real world, we have the Excel template as a tool that could help track your project architecture and consistency in a regular way with high level of transparency, visibility. I see this in next way. At the beginning, the project architect and technical lead of the project agree on the metrics in all listed 6 areas that describe the software product consistency: code base, infrastructure, qualities, scope and process, technical depth, documentation. They also agree on the schedule and communication flow. Checkpoints could be done twice or once a month. All required metric could be collected by team or technical lead or senior engineer. It's not a rocket science. You just need an access to infrastructure and source code. In the planned column, you can see parameters that could be taken from the software architecture documents. You need these numbers in front of you in order to be able to compare these numbers with the actual product state. The presented on the slide information is just an example. It's not a real project. I just listed these numbers that present the idea in most evident way. Let's start with code metrics. For example, in the very beginning, when you have, for example, discovery stage, you have to suggest some architecture. You stated that it's going to be microservice architecture. You presented 10 different microservices on the diagram located in 10 different repositories. So that you can see how the amount of repositories increases with the time. Somehow you get to know that there is 11th. It could be the sign that some functionality was split between repositories, and you have to update, actualize architecture documentation. Or the team missed something and need help to find the right place to land the new piece of functionality. Yes, in ideal world, team or technical lead should ask if something is unclear, but usually it doesn't work as it has to. Sometimes there is no questions, sometimes there are too many questions, sometimes there are questions, but the result is something different. So that's why architects should constantly analyze the metrics in order to ask the right question. And right question is not, is everything is okay? No. You should ask concrete question, right question to your team members. You'll probably ask why pull request amount could be a metric for an architect. That's a good question. Sometimes the maturity of team couldn't be enough to provide a high level of quality review. That's why in the technical or team lead becomes overloaded with reviewing. The queue of pull requests dramatically increases. Why it should bother the architect? First of all, architect could help with the review. And the secondary, could propose introducing automated code review tools and making the team lead free of these duties. He can help to convince, for example, a client to introduce such practice. I'm sure you can suggest many other code metrics, but I highly recommend having a limited amount of parameters for each of the key areas. It could be 3 to 5, just the most important for your point of view. Otherwise, you'll flood with measurements. The next area is infrastructure. As a part of software architecture document, an architect presents infrastructure cost analysis for each of environments. There are calculation of the cost of production, testing, or development environments. So those parameters are our planned metrics for the development environment and for production as well. Build failed number, or the ratio to total amount of builds could be also the metric, and it also could be helpful and can help architect to identify some problems on the project. The next area are qualities. I listed here only 3, but usually there are a lot of such metrics and such parameters on every project. So here you shouldn't stop on only 5 metrics. You should list it here all metrics required to your project. Suppose the architect conducted a quality attributes workshop, or you drew some utility tree during the project discovery phase. In that case, the software architecture documents could have the listed quality scenarios and metrics to which the product has to correspond. These metrics should be placed and continuously checked somehow. I suggest to use this way on the regular basis, and it could help you to understand on the earlier stages if something went wrong. The next area is scope and process. You shouldn't go into the project management tools. It's better just to have few metrics that can tell you a lot. For example, growing amount of features, as you can see on the slide, or the ratio result to planned stories. Documentation. Documentation is a weak area of each of the growing product. I don't have to say that it's important to actualize the documentation and keep it up to date on the regular ways. Otherwise, you have to rewrite it from scratch, and it could take a lot of time. And sometimes you just throw away the initial architecture document and forget about it. Technical debt. Here could be technical or architecture debt. I assume that technical debt collection and identification and management is a technical project lead responsibility. But software architects should control this process. Technical debt could be, but small and fast to fix. That's why it's not only amount of tickets, but the average time to fix as well. I would like to emphasize that the planned parameters, it's your product and system on the first day of the release to production. And how close your product and consistency to 0, so great job you did as an architect to help the team achieve this. To see the actual state of inconsistency on your project or projects, you can use such radial graph. Furthermore, if you have multiple ongoing projects, you can arrange such graphs, such diagrams into one dashboard. So why not to build consistency visualization? It's a good point. I believe it's mostly psychological point. Imagine that the diagram in case of inconsistency measurement. Yes, mainly it will present almost zero on axis, and it's not representative. And there is no call to action for software architect. That's why I'd recommend to go with inconsistency, because according to the slide, you can just see what are areas on the project are required for your attention. It's the code, infrastructure, qualities, and mostly process. I think it's a very representative way how to visualize inconsistency of the project. And if you get everything on zero on the first day of your release, you are really successful. And you need to go to that point. The interesting thing, I think that you also have to collect the historical information and maybe track your performance and your inconsistency on the long period of time. It's also could be interesting for you as an architect. So, tools. If you don't have a team or you don't have access to the team, to have you with some code metrics measurements, and there is only you and the source code base, there are many tools to assess architecture and the code. Some of them are paid, some work with a limited amount of technologies. So I highly recommend to use these tools, especially before the release, as you do performance analysis, for example, before the release. You check if your system corresponds to some performance metrics. The same you need to do with your architecture. You need to at least once run architecture analysis tools and eliminate the problems with your architecture if there are such problems. So Titan introduces a new architecture model called design rule space, intended to capture both the architecture and the evolutionary structure of systems to identify architectural issues. The second most used tools are Structure 101 and Sonar Graph. These two commercial tools are static analyzers implementing functionalities to support software architects through dependency and modularity analysis at various levels of abstraction. However, as I said, initially, if you have different technologies on projects, it could be hard to use so many tools. And you can spend much time setting up the measurement process, synchronize with your dashboards and or spreadsheets and so on and so forth. So I recommend to use such tools from time to time, and definitely before the release day, to measure if you have an architect depth on your project. But these tools couldn't cover all inconsistency on your project. Such tool doesn't help you with measurements the inconsistency between the code infrastructure and documentation in form of maybe some Word documents, README files, diagrams, and so on and so forth. That's why we, for now, cannot go without such Excel templates. I highly recommend to try such template at least one time, tailor it according to your project, and figure out is it work for you or not. So, how to introduce this practice on your projects? I think it could be really hard, but at the very beginning, you need to do really right thing. At the very beginning, you need to focus on documentation. It's critically important because, as you can see from inconsistency management template, if you don't have documentation, if you don't have parameters identified at the very beginning, if and you don't know how to measure the quality of your system, so your architecture will fail. Documentation should be just enough. It's not about the quantity of pages. It's about the quality, and the quality is that your team can understand it, documentation, and have ability to build the system as you designed in the very beginning. I think that documentation should be changed evolutionary during the full period of the project life cycle. That's why you need to track on the regular basis if you have updated architecture document, if you have updated README files in your repositories, if you have updated API documentation. It could be really helpful to achieve almost 100% consistency at the release day, at least in document direction. The next one is communication framework. So you cannot measure inconsistency alone without the team. You need to communicate somehow with the team, and team should help you to get this metrics for your document, for your dashboard. So at the very beginning, you need to present and sell this document to your team, explain why these key areas are important, and you together can select right metrics appropriate for your specific project. So it's a collaborative work with your team. And you need to set up regular meetings, not with all the team. It's not about the free discussion of how everything is going on. It's a specific discussion how is our product regarding metrics that we have and what steps we have to do in order to achieve 100 consistency of the project or 0 inconsistency. So that's why you need to set up regular meetings with only one person. It could be technical lead or senior software engineer or someone who is responsible for leadership or technical leadership on your project. And the main thing is not to reschedule. Here is very important to track the progress on the regular way. Maybe you don't have much time But this approach and this communication to sync up measurements and your understanding of the project can take no longer than 15 minutes. I don't think that you need to spend 2 hours in discussing something if you have such metrics. You can observe metrics in advance and just ask the right question during the meeting. That's this inconsistency template is for. So do regular measurements. Regularity, it's the heart of this presented concept. And I'm not sure that if you have a 1 year duration project development, you have to do this once a week. I think twice a month could be quite enough to achieve required level of granularity for such kind of metrics. And analysis. You as an architect have the full picture, and it's you who has to do this analysis and raise a red flag to the team members, customers, or maybe managers if you see that the deadline is close but inconsistency is almost obsolete. You have all this um, picture in front of you through this spreadsheet, and you are able to analyze this metrics, analyze the tendencies. That's why, as I listed on the slide, you have even deadline, not to forget, to software architect, especially if software architect has been working on multiple projects. So it's just a way how to concentrate on the right schedule deadlines and current status of the project. So I really sure that this tool could be helpful, especially for software architects in consulting, because I know and I am also struggling of missing such tools, such dashboards. I want to go somewhere and double check that everything is right. I'm going into the right direction. This template can help you to focus on the main key areas, on the code, on the infrastructure, on the documentation, technical or architecture depth, and on the scope and process. Everything, as I mentioned, requires to make right decision, right and fast. So that is pretty much it. Again, I want to thank you. And I hope that this inconsistency measurement and management template and this approach, how to introduce it into your project, can help you to take care of multiple projects with less stress and more significant transparency. You can also share this document with your team, with your management, and even with your customer to reason about ways how to fight with inconsistency. Because you have the regular measurements, and if you have all this historical information on the one page, it's really simple to reason about inconsistency. Thank you very much.